The Civic Action Team is a legislative campaign that used to be held by 350 Seattle for the last several years, really based and kind of held by 350 Seattle. And that is from an era where the 12 different 350 groups in Washington didn't really know each other. And so we each sort of did our different campaigns independently across the state. But a legislative campaign really does have statewide impact. Well, a little bit over a year ago, we started forming a new network or a coalition of all 12 groups. So we are now 350 Washington as a coalition, but each of the 12 groups in the coalition is an independent organization. We have shared mission and values, and we've agreed to share this campaign because we understand that with our own statewide power as 12 different groups sprinkled across the state, we can accomplish so much more together when it comes to statewide policy. And we can ensure that voices from those spaces all across the state are actually impacting the quality and the kind of work that we do together. And so there's a really interesting relationship in that these 12 groups across the state are all volunteer run 350 groups, just like the vast majority of all 350 groups of the US. So these are independent organizations coming together with some shared values and shared goals, but they're almost all completely volunteer run. So I think why that's really important is that when we start thinking about our campaigns work in the statewide context, it's important for folks to know that the 350 Washington Network as an organization sits on the steering committee of the Climate Alliance in Washington. So we sit in the Climate Alliance with Sierra Club and Washington Environmental Council, as well as a significant amount of labor unions, intertribal networks, frontline community groups such as Familias Unidas, Front and Centered, many organizations across the state, pulling together really all of the different voices and expertise, and anything that has to do with climate is really sitting in that space. And so we meet all year. Some organizations, as they're approaching like, okay, so a bit of context, we have an agreement in the Climate Alliance across all these organizations that while we may not totally all agree on carbon pricing, and we understand that it can be a divisive issue across organizations, the Alliance works really hard to make sure that even if we're not advocating for exactly the same policies, we're transparent with each other in ways that help us all understand each other's work. And so yesterday, I attended our monthly steering committee meeting, which was really fantastic, and got a great chance to hear like, how are all these different types of organizations responding to the big carbon question? And I think it's just really wonderful to name that we as an all volunteer network who are learning how to work together, learning how to make policy decisions together and have positions and endorse things. It is okay if we're not a huge green organization that has like a big staff of policy analysts that can put out a big, like, here's our stance on something right away. It's actually okay for us to hold this as a network with some ambiguity and move a bit slower, because our goals are really to bring all the groups, all the volunteers into shared work together. So that's a bit of context for kind of what the network is and how our Civic Action Team legislative engagement work is held by the network, which is then held by the Climate Alliance Coalition space. That may have raised more questions than it answered, but I think all those pieces are really helpful to understand the updates that I'd like to give from the Climate Alliance around how all the different groups are approaching carbon pricing and what options we have as a Civic Action Team, as a team of campaigners holding a legislative campaign as a network of many different groups who have different perspectives, who are also all volunteer. Was that helpful for folks to hear all that as we're entering into the space? Yeah, awesome. I see a thumbs up from you, Brandon. Yeah, and so even on this call, like I see people who are board members and local group leaders of your specific 350 group. I also see volunteers from 350 groups. I also see volunteers in this space who came to this campaign because you're passionate about legislature, who aren't necessarily rooted in a 350 group, which is the beauty of this campaign, right, is to bring folks into this space to help plug folks into those local groups as well. I also know that there's folks here who are from other organizations who are just, perhaps like interested in this campaign or have more that we want to learn. So the policy discussion that we want to have today is really our best attempt to have a big container for all of us to engage around what makes good policy. And it is okay if the 350 Washington Network ultimately doesn't decide to endorse a particular stance, because not all groups in the Climate Alliance are taking a particular stance. So that kind of leads me to the report back I'd love to give from the Climate Alliance meeting yesterday, where I heard from all of the groups in the Climate Alliance how we're approaching our carbon pricing conversations. I'm gonna do my best to not just talk at folks. Or if I'm raising more questions when I answer, feel free to drop in the chat or wave at me. So some two big top things kind of from the two bills that we want to talk about: Washington Strong and Cap and Trade. The big highlights I'd like to let folks know about Washington Strong before we pivot and talk about Cap and Trade, which is, I think, possibly where we want to spend some more time on discussion, is that there is broad consensus in yesterday's steering committee meeting that when it comes to Washington Strong, there are no major coalition partner concerns around what's around that being a divisive policy. There is naming in the Climate Alliance space that we haven't actually seen the bill yet. It hasn't been filed. We actually need to do our due diligence and look at that bill when it gets filed. And each of our organizations will make decisions on that. But folks in the Climate Alliance aren't articulating that we anticipate a lot of dissent or confusion around Washington Strong. Folks really want to see it and make sure that it's good policy. And we want to keep in mind that these two carbon policies, it's not either or. So lots of organizations might be excited about Washington Strong and endorse it. And then there may be a mixed bag of responses for this other policy, but no one's in a position to have to choose to advocate for either one or the other. So it sounds like the Washington Strong bill is going to be filed next week, and all of these different organizations in the Climate Alliance are chomping at the bit to finally get to look at it, and are really excited to likely advocate for it if it looks good. And listening to each other in that space. Like if one organization says, wow, we looked at it and this is what we see, then in the Climate Alliance, we want to be hearing from those groups too. So this brings me to our Cap and Trade / Cap and Invest. I'm going to give a couple of broad strokes, and Catherine and David, if you feel like I'm missing some pieces, do let me know. The really big broad strokes are that we know that when it comes to the concept of Cap and Trade, many organizations, including BIPOC-led organizations and frontline community organizations, have a strong no stance against any Cap and Trade model. We also know that several organizations within the Climate Alliance and within Washington State that are BIPOC-led, including Front and Centered, which is a big coalition, huge coalition, Got Green, which is based out of Seattle, Puget Sound Sage, which I believe is based out of Seattle as well. These organizations have come out very strongly against the Carlisle bill. And there's some really great content and some blog posts and some articles and some sort of like articulation of why. Now it's interesting being in the Climate Alliance Steering Committee space, because we're all on a Zoom call like this, each of us from our different organizations saying, our organization says no. The beauty of the Climate Alliance is that these are deep relationships that are built over years. We meet every month, and that our commitment to each other is that we're just transparent with each other about how we're approaching Cap and Trade. We don't all have to have the same opinion to still be in the alliance together. And I think it's helpful to name that several organizations, David, will you help me know which organization Rebecca Ponzio is with?
WEC, Washington Environmental Council.
Yeah, so Washington Environmental Council's report to the Alliance last night, or yesterday afternoon, was just to let folks know we are not going to be actively opposing this. As an organization, we're advocating that all of the equity concerns, the Climate Alliance, we do have a shared set of equity concerns for all carbon pricing that we've agreed to be pushing forward on any carbon pricing. So Washington Environmental Council would like to see how far we can push this cap and invest bill towards those equity goals, and let's keep seeing how we can get there. So that's what Rebecca let us know from that space. And in addition, TNC, which I believe is the Nature Conservatory, yeah, I'm not sure the C word, identical approach. We're kind of watching this, we're advocating for these equity criteria to absolutely be met in this bill, but we'd like to see how many transformations the bill can get through. So other groups in the space are communicating their carbon stances from very different ways. So for instance, there's a gentleman in the space who's representing an intertribal network. And he lets us know that the way their network works can't really come to some big group stance. And so they're approaching it more in a piecemeal way. And there's not an expectation that that steering committee group would have some formal stance. And so I just want to kind of paint the picture that in the Climate Alliance, there's a room for a lot of different organizations to hold the carbon conversation differently. And so I let folks know in the Climate Alliance that at 350 Washington and with the Civic Action Team, we are a big new network of volunteers learning to work together, wanting to hold good policy conversations. We are going through a discussion about whether or not we're going to oppose with recommendations, or we're making a decision about if we're going to have an official stance. But as a network, it's going to take time to have those conversations well. We may not ever be able to actually have a public stance officially, which is also okay. But I did let them know that in the Civic Action Team, since we are empowered by our network's mission and values, our default stance is always going to be to follow the voices of frontline community groups when it comes to policy that impacts frontline community groups. So we have this great guidance with our shared mission and values as a network to say in the Civic Action Team, we're going to be advocating that the actions that we take around cap and trade are really to amplify the frontline community voice concerns around this policy and to push for equity criteria. We can do that as a network and as a campaign without having to come to some network-wide consensus on a particular stance on this bill. And that's because in the Climate Alliance space, there's a lot of graciousness for the many types of coalitions that work in that space, and a recognition that not every organization, like for instance, a huge intertribal network or a big statewide network of independent groups, has the infrastructure to have a formal position in the same way that like a big green organization, like a big staffed organization could. And that's okay. I think the most important goals for me in this campaign are to make sure that we're bringing folks into policy discussions in a good way and understanding where we're transparent with others, where power is held, and at the end of the day, which values are we following? Go for it, David.
Kevin asked a question in the chat about disseminating these policy positions taken by these other groups. And Grace, based on my past participation in those types of meetings and in having seen the types of notes that come out of them, my reflection to Kevin is that what you're telling us now is the most we're going to get in terms of documentation of some of those other groups' positions. Some of them, as you're referencing, don't even have formal positions on a website. Am I correct in that perception?
Yeah, I think that's fairly accurate. And in terms of disseminating this information out, I think the really big question is I'm a new person sitting in the steering committee role this past year. My questions are, how can I sit as the steering committee person who's representing our network, how can I make sure that information is flowing out of that alliance space into the work that we do, that informs the work, that helps us all be aware of the statewide landscape that we're operating in. I do get a big recap and partner calls to action and any partner information from the Climate Alliance. I get those from Lauren. She should be sending the recap from yesterday out today or tomorrow. Included in that is like all the great policy documents that everybody in the space really wants to make sure we're sharing with each other. I'm always doing my best to share those out across the 350 Washington Network listserv, which is our broad decentralized communication tool that we use as a network to talk to each other. And that gives all the local groups and all of the volunteers who are in that space a chance to just know the latest. What's going on with the Climate Alliance? What are our partners asking? What's happening with all these various things? I want to let, go for it, David.
But based on the past communications that we've seen, the kind of granular information that you're giving us in this call is not likely to be contained in that summary email. So just to set expectations really clearly.
Yes, thank you, David.
Okay.
And the Climate Alliance also has several other working spaces that we are able to be in to get more up-to-date info. So our intern Cha-Cha sits on the every other week advocacy team space, where all the different groups are basically saying, here's our social media toolkits, here's how we're going to launch this one next week, here's the latest on this. And then Cha-Cha is able to bring that back to our campaign. But we are seeking ways to keep getting information from the Climate Alliance into the work that we do. So I'd like to keep exploring how to report back from the steering committee space in ways that help us all understand the landscape of the work that we're in, so that we are working well with each other. I think I'm gonna
clarifying that. I appreciate the follow-up on the question, David. The Grace, if I just want to clarify that Rebecca Ponzio from WEC said that they are taking a wait and see attitude, and I believe they have some criteria around carbon policy. Was that information provided to you in the EPC meeting by chance, and is something that you might be able to pass on to us, or did they not provide that information that you have available to pass on?
Do you mean information on their exact stance?
I think that my understanding of I think I heard you say, if I remember right, that WEC has not taken a stance yet. Is that true?
Yeah, and that their approach may not be to take a stance in opposition or one way or the other. Their approach may be, let's continue advocating for our equity criteria. That is, a shared criteria across the Climate Alliance.
Right, and did they share that criteria with the group? And if so, is that available to us?
Yes, it's available from the Resilient Futures campaign page. There's a link there to their Resilient Future platform. And in the Resilient Future platform is a link that uses the word equity. And that's where you'll find it. And that information has been shared now for some number of weeks.
And just to let folks know, that is what is linked on our 350washington.org website, is that Climate Alliance equity criteria. So our formal stance as a network at the moment on our website is, as members of the Climate Alliance, we're going to be advocating for this equity criteria. And that is the default position for all Climate Alliance partners. So it's one shared document, one shared statement. And yeah, does that help answer your question? Okay. So a beautiful thing about the Climate Alliance is there's this recognition that so many different perspectives and goals to give us tools to be able to walk. We get a default position of supporting an equity criteria if an organization is not in a position to take a stance. We get given tools to work well with each other. I'm going to end it at that because I want to hand it back to you, Catherine, to help facilitate the discussion we want to have, and want to name that I know folks probably need to hop off at the top of the hour. We may not close everything in this discussion here, but I would love to hand it to you, Catherine, so that everyone in this space can start engaging in this.
Sure. Well, one question I had is, if any of us individually feel very strongly about this policy, and this is a clarifying question, we can act as individuals however we want, advocating by pro or opposing. And, but we just wouldn't include the Washington network in that advocacy. Correct? Is that something that we even want to
Oh, yeah.
address or?
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, very quickly, as individuals, any of us can do anything. As local groups, we're realizing since we're a brand new network, it would be good for us to come to an agreement as local groups in the network. Are we cool with local groups kind of always doing whatever they want on, like taking their own stance that could be different from the network, or does that set us up for failure? We haven't actually decided as a network how we want to hold policy distinctions or differences, and that's okay. We can figure out how to do that. But as of now, when we're operating in the civic action team, that is our space to be representing the network, and so that's where we want to be most in alignment with the Climate Alliance. And there's room, I really feel like there's room for all the groups that are network to also individually advocate for things that we care about, but it's probably a space we want to get a policy in place to help us if there's ever conflict.
Great. Okay, so thank you, Grace, and thanks so much for all of the background, because I think it's important for us to have that grounding and understand, you know, how decisions end up getting made within the network and the civic action team. But maybe for the next 25 minutes, we could just discuss what is on people's minds. And usually those are, you know, still questions that people have around the cap and trade, or clarifications that you would like to see if anyone can help with that, or things you've heard. I think now it's really just open discussion. What is sitting with you?
Yeah. So perhaps a way to facilitate that is that if folks want to hop in line with questions, go in the chat and we'll just do our very best to facilitate folks in a very good way. All right, Rosemary, you are up.
I have a question. Does cap and trade allow polluters to continue polluting? Very simple.
So I'll take a stab at that. The way cap and trade is intended to work is that there is a cap that says no more than this much, and that then goes down over time. Anyone who goes above that, who basically breaks through the cap, has to purchase some allowance that gives the state money. And those allowances can be traded amongst the members. And so the intention is that the super green, whatever it is, generates some credits that then it can sell to the oil refinery, because the oil refinery can't move fast enough to clean up its act. But that eventually the cap will force all players to become cleaner. That's the economic model for it that I've learned. But it does allow those polluters to delay cleaning up their act. And there's a lot of evidence, some evidence that's debated, some evidence that seems pretty clear from California, having done this, that pollution has not improved in the frontline groups proximate to a lot of the point sources of pollution. So that is part of the motivation for the opposition by frontline groups. To be fair to them, they are also expressing opposition to just the whole market approach of dealing with pollution in that way.
Great. And Kevin had a comment. I'm just going to go through the list that I see in chat.
Great, thank you. David, I'm sorry, I missed the exact point where the BIPOC communities were concerned about the market approach. Did they express that?
Got Green, I think, is probably the most articulate on this point. And so I believe they've got material on their website, and there were links to material, I think, in the email for this meeting. Puget Sound Sage is also very clear on that. The last information that I saw from Front and Centered, I don't recall them being quite as detailed in their opposition to cap and trade, but I think there might be some archival stuff on their site. But they're the ones who are saying, yeah, the pollution doesn't go away fast enough. And they're got green in particular as opposed to market solutions as an approach to dealing with pollution.
There is a video that Got Green, I believe, has put on their website that is almost a panel discussion or talking about their point of view. Margie, I'm sorry, Margie, did you have a question?
Yes, I was wondering if the mitigation under cap and trade, the carbon credits, had to be within our state. And if so, if in trying to mold the legislation, if that would be some place to say, okay, it has to be mitigated in this frontline community or that
Yeah.
sort, these.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, because I know we're getting a lot of questions. The California is criticized for allowing offsets, and offsets are a way to say, oh, clean it up over here and I get the credit for that, and that allows me to continue doing my polluting. The California caps theirs at 8% of whatever total, I can't really explain that part, but like only so many offsets can be used. The Washington cap and trade plan has some similar number, and I don't know whether the current plan specifies that those offsets, those mitigations, need to be in state or not. But I suspect it is not wholly limited to in state, because it's my understanding that the Nature Conservancy is offering some amendments or some modifying ideas. And one of those is to make the offsets more in state than they are now. So you're right on target with thinking that is a potential improvement.
Annie, did you want to ask your question? And Josh, I know you have maybe something to add to this, but I will jump over to Annie first.
There's a cap on the carbon emitted. Is that a total cap on all the industries and all the emitters, or is it just for each one?
I can't answer that to the detail that you might want, but my understanding is that it is a cap that is defined broadly, and then each one has to fit within that. And what the mechanism is for that, I'm not entirely clear, to be honest. That would be something to look at the legislation. Oh, and one caveat. One of the concerns around any carbon pricing scheme is that is this concept that in the jargon is leakage, and that's not leakage of emissions in the sense of gas coming out of a pipeline. That's leakage in the sense of you have a jurisdiction for the policy, and your cement plant or your aluminum smelter or somebody who's like is described by an acronym EITE, energy intensive trade exposed, and that they say, oh, we're competing on a global stage and you're imposing this restraint on me, and so what I'm going to do is just move across the state line where I can continue to operate the same way that I have been and continue to pollute. And so that is leakage. And so to try to prevent that, these types of state level policies typically provide those companies with exemptions. And so that is a whole place to analyze these different policies to see whether, who gets a pass. Does aviation fuel get a pass? Does our only last aluminum plant get a pass? That kind of thing.
Thank you, David. And Jeannie was able to listen to the hearing, and so she has a report on that, which is great.
Not only did she listen, she gave live testimony. It was fascinating to have Senator Lovelat work with Senator Carlisle. He talked about the bill. You can actually click on the bill and read about it on 45 pages. And I have to give huge kudos to David Perk and to Catherine Leggett in Grace's little email on the chewing and stewing. Man, that just, you guys had done so much homework. So thank you for that. Senator Carlisle, it was fascinating. It took 2 hours of live testimony for all the people to say whether they were for it or against it. There were a number of Vlad Gutman, Climate Solutions for it, Nature Conservancy for it, WCV, WEC came out in support of it. All your BIPOC communities came out against it. Labor came out against it. It was actually when the executive of BP came out in support of it, I was like going, oh, please don't make me go testify after this, you know, polished executive. But the bottom line, when you read about cap and trade, and the major concern to me is that it is supported by West Petroleum things. It is supported by Chevron and BP, and it does do this little shell game with permits and offsets, and it doesn't really make the pollution go away. It just allows it to move around. And I think once Washington Strong does get its announcement made for the bill, there'll be, if you know, if not a bunch of people saying, this is so much stronger, it's so much better, it's going to be the bold legislation that we need in a climate crisis. I think that will change a lot of people's minds, if not allow, as David alluded to earlier in conversations, that there could be collaborations. But you only had a minute and a half, and it took 2 hours. So it was really an amazing experience. I think I was the only hillbilly that gave live testimony, but I'm really knowledgeable about the differences. I've spent hours researching about it. I've written a letter to the editor. I gave live testimony because, bottom line, why would you trust fossil fuel companies to instigate legislation to reduce fossil fuels? It's what they make money at. So yeah, I think that's my bottom line, and I was there. If you have any questions, welcome to send to me about it.
Thank you so much.
Yay, Jean, thank you.
Awesome. You know, and attending these hearings is how we're going to, you know, get this kind of information. So thank you for attending. I am planning to attend the one at 10 a.m. as well for Healthy Homes. That's happening at 10 a.m. today. So great job. And testifying. That's amazing. Thank you. And so just so we get through a couple more, I know Josh had a comment related to one of our earlier questions, and has some insight from Representative Pollitt to share.
Yeah, sorry, I missed, can you hear me? Great. Yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning of the meeting. And so hopefully I'm not repeating something that was already said, but a group of 5 of us met with Representative Pollitt from the 46th district yesterday. And 350 Seattle, as far as I understand, has already come out against the cap and trade bill, and we expressed that, and we said that we are following the lead of Puget Sound Sage, Got Green, and Front and Center on this issue, and we asked that Representative Pollitt do this. And he said, his response was basically, equity is important. This is a bill that might pass versus other carbon pricing bills that he didn't know much about. He was open to the idea of a different form of carbon pricing that would be more effective and more equitable. But he asked that we change our language from oppose to prefer something else. So we are currently drafting our email response to him right now, and I'm excited to hear what other people say and how this conversation goes to learn more.
Interesting. I guess
Hey, Harley. Nice to hear from you.
just
Josh, Josh, would you mind actually, I had to look at something. When you're talking about which organization you're representing, when you say that, can you repeat that again? Your organization drafting a response to that request. Was that to the 350 Washington Network or to a separate group?
That was to Representative Pollitt from the 5 of us that met with him, mostly representing 350 Seattle. And then depending on this conversation, we could say this is the position of 350 Washington, or we could avoid saying that.
Ah, gotcha.
And I'm curious to hear
I
how this
gotcha.
conversation goes to figure out how we should frame that.
Thank you. So basically, meeting with them and this person asking 350 Seattle to change their stance from opposed to prefer something else.
Correct.
Okay.
And Representative Pollitt, I think, wants to vote in favor of this, would be my read. And if it comes to him, it's not in the House right now.
I gotcha. Okay.
But
Yeah.
that would be asking him to take a big change in position from probably what he's comfortable with. And so
Yeah. Okay. One piece I'd love to add to that, Josh, and then would love to hear from others as well. And I dropped it in the chat. Puget Sound Sage has reached out to 350 Seattle and CC'd the 350 Washington Network. I think groups are just beginning to understand that there is a network and how to talk to us about things like this. But we have been asked to support Puget Sound Sage, Got Green, and Front and Center in taking a stance of opposing this. 350 Seattle historically has already taken this stance and signed on to this. So 350 Seattle as an entity has, my understanding of that, David, has officially already a stance of supporting Got Green and BIPOC groups on this. That doesn't mean that as a network that we have to come to a formal consensus, but I do want to let folks know that it's out to the 350 Washington Network Council, all of our local group leaders, to respond to this request from Puget Sound Sage for allyship. So we are looking at a decision as a network to, does our network feel strongly about aligning with BIPOC-led groups on this, or are we going to be taking a different approach? So that is a formal decision in front of the 350 Washington Network decision-making body, which is 2 folks from each group right now. And it is a request that we have been asked from Puget Sound Age, will we support them in that? And then I'll zip it and Catherine allow you to facilitate the conversation some more.
Sure. I know Emily has a question on that, but before, just to kind of keep going down the list, Kevin was going to give an update or a view on the 2 bills from Representative Fitzgibbon.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. I haven't talked a lot with Representative Fitzgibbon. One of the attributes of a cap and trade system that he was really positive about was that it does legislate a reduction in carbon pollution. And while I think there's been discussions about, David, you mentioned that there are caps that are applied across the system. Within the system, people can trade back and forth. So carbon polluters can get a pass, if you will, from those who are making great strides in efficiency. But I think it is the impression I get from Representative Fitzgibbon is that the overall trend is reducing carbon. It's not that people just trade it back and forth and we have a consistent amount of pollution. He says, no, actually, we put that into the plan and we have a curve of reducing carbon emissions and we control that. His alternative, or the other approach with a tax is that the impression I got, and this is where my question is, if we know, the impression is we're letting the market and taxation and market forces actually determine the amount of investment that would be made in like a green bonds program to actually allow us to make those investments. Once we collect some money from the tax, we can make investments in how to drive carbon down. But his concern was that we're letting the market influence that. We're not actually putting it in statute, which forces it down a certain curve. I don't know if anybody's had that conversation to provide insight there and what you might be able to share with us.
350 Seattle has written to Fitzgibbon and gotten similar response. And if you look at the bill summary for the cap and trade legislation that we're looking at here in this session, it's in two parts, and one part is about setting up the trade system, and another part, says yes, it sets up a framework that says we have carbon reduction goals from the state that currently have no legislative teeth. The cap and trade bill would give them teeth. So that is definitely a positive attribute of that bill. And whether the Washington Strong bill can do something similar or not is something that I think we're going to have to wait and see what they come up with. I think that Fitzgibbon has a good basis for concern that it will not, but there were people who are on the advocacy side for Washington Strong saying that they were coming up with something where maybe it would. However, just to imagine that perhaps it does not have that same kind of linkage, I think it might be important to consider that neither policy is going to, no price on carbon can be set high enough to accomplish the reductions that are needed in a smooth and efficient manner. We've let things go for so long that the baseline price on carbon needs to be like $70 a ton yesterday. So starting out there is going to be this tremendous economic shock. So one way to think about it is the carbon price needs to be internalized into the system. And, that's a positive attribute for either one, but then it may be better to think of it in terms of this is a way of getting revenue and then what is done with that revenue. Neither plan is taking the approach that has been floated in the past or is being floated at the federal level of returning the money to everyone. Instead, they are saying, we're going to use that money and this is how we're going to do it. And you can compare both plans against each other that way too.
So we have about 5 more minutes. I did just add this video that I watched a couple of weeks ago. And one thing I've kind of gathered is Front and Centered is part of an alliance as well of BIPOC-led community groups. And from what I gathered, that alliance has been meeting for years. It's an important alliance for this group. And this panel kind of is part of that alliance. And it's useful to listen to. And it was 30 minutes and I recommend it. Rosemary, did you want to add your comment?
Yeah, just in response to what David was saying about the cap and trade having teeth, and we don't currently have teeth to enforce our emission goals. Are there other ways of having teeth?
Frankly, Rosemary, that's something I'm really curious about. I don't have a solid answer. The emission reduction targets was a bill that passed last year, and it's basically aspirational and brings the state targets in line with the Paris, which might be the 1.5 degrees that isn't even itself sufficient. Not entirely clear, but it was so much better than what we had previously. But there was no mechanism to sort of enforce it. I think that might be something that the people debating this policy might be trying to come up with. Maybe if cap and trade gets so much resistance, there will be some conversation amongst the policymakers to say, how do we move this enforcement, into the system? Maybe Washington Strong drafters have come up with something that is good enough. I'm not sure, but conceivably we could have these two policies kind of both stall, and we move ahead this session with things like the Healthy Homes and Clean Cars 2030 and Clean Fuels, and we make sector by sector advances, and then do those advances actually move us towards our goal or not? And is there any, statutory mechanism that enforces that? That we may come out of the session without that. Unclear to me.
Great. Well, I think I've caught up in the chat with all of the questions. And Grace, I know you were about to jump in as well. I guess for me, I'm curious, and you can let Grace, David, or myself or know if you'd like to have another discussion, a follow-up discussion. This focused quite a bit on policy, which I'm really grateful for, but there's also political elements to this bill, which we haven't discussed, which I'm grateful for, but that might be something that people are interested in. And so if you're interested in follow-up conversations, let us know. But Grace, I'll have you close out if you don't mind.
Yeah. I just want to say how grateful I am to everyone in this space, in the volunteer space, in the network space, for being willing to go along on this shared learning experience together about how to show up in a statewide space in a really good way as a huge, huge team. I want to keep reminding us that as a team, it is okay to move slowly in the statewide space as we work to carry this work well together. And overall, like my goal would be, even if the 350 Washington network isn't robust enough or doesn't have enough infrastructure to do some deep policy analysis on every policy that comes out, that in the civic action team, we're generally doing a very good job plugged in the ways that we are statewide. I think we're doing a wonderful job. I hope that no one feels under a ton of pressure to come to decisions really quickly on carbon pricing, because I'm more interested in us learning as a network how to have policy analysis conversations. And ultimately, I am more interested in everyone on this call in understanding all of the moving pieces that we're in so that we can each be better at this work that we do. So I think where I'd like to pin it is that, and I put this in the chat, we get to kind of decide how we want to be as a network and as a campaign. Do we want to be the kind of organization that wants to thread that political needle on carbon pricing and say we have this robust policy analysis team that we amongst ourselves actually know the answers to all of these questions we have about this particular cap and trade bill? So we can feel that we could put out an official statement saying yes, so we're for it. Or are we kind of network that wants to work more nimbly and hit the high notes, and maybe on something like carbon pricing, stay in the Climate Alliance default position and follow BIPOC leadership? We get to make decisions about how deep do we want to go into the kind of work we're doing. And so all that to say, I want to thank everyone for your patience as we learn how to let communications flow and information flow, and everyone know where we fit into the big pictures of this. And I want to keep working in ways that help everyone in this space understand how to be in the space well and have these conversations. And if folks want to form a team in the Civic Action team to specifically dive into this Cap and Invest bill and like make that the bill that we nerd out on more than anything else in terms of bill tracking and statewide analysis, we can do that if we want to. Or perhaps we say we've got our energies going elsewhere in this campaign. We're good with this sort of default stance. And like Emily's comment in the chat from 350 Spokane, so many of our BIPOC community partners are coming out against this bill. Why even have the conversation? So there's many different directions this can go. We get to decide how we want to do it as a team. And I want to do my best to make sure that folks who are in decision-making positions and positions of power in this whole space, that folks understand where decisions are happening and where analysis is happening, and ultimately which values we're landing in the work that we do. That's a bit of a spiel. Ideally, a conversation like this would have room for everyone's voices and we would be able to talk quite a bit more. Maybe I'll just flip this idea. Does it feel helpful to almost like pause this conversation and pick it up again in our next conversation. Do we feel like we want a part 2 on how we want to approach carbon pricing as a team? Yeah.
Grace, there were some comments in the chat that like, yes, after Washington Strong is available, we should have another conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which implies to me that those people who are most interested in that are actually going to read it, which is fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, so it seems like what we're identifying is that we want to create a mixed space where our local group leaders, our volunteers, people who are maybe in other coalition spaces, like for instance, Brandon, thank you so much for being here, and Josh stepping into that space as well. We want to create a container for us to all have these conversations well. So let's maybe move forward with the assumption that we're going to keep having this conversation. Washington Strong was going to come up, various other space conversations are going to come up. We don't have to have all the answers right now for how we want to approach this as a network. I feel pretty good about how we're carrying this in CAT. Our ask last week was, hey, our network doesn't have a formal position. For now, we're advocating that folks follow the voices of frontline community groups. To me, that feels like a, we can point to our mission and values and say, this is the framework that we do have to carry this work right now. Yeah, that's where I'm going to put a pin in that and say, let's keep talking about carbon pricing and think about how to have part of this weekly space together where we do these conversations, where all this brain dump needs to happen. And we are still co-creating how to work together and what kind of spaces we need. So that's my attempt at wrapping this conversation in a good way, folks. And
I'll add one point. You know, I imagine all of us have been in spaces where one of our grounding statements have been expect non-closure. And I think that's one to consider for this specific policy. And that's what I'm taking away, is that no, we're not going to be able to, you know, have this all neatly tied in a bow after 1 hour discussion, but we can keep discussing and we'll make sure that happens. Okay, thanks for all your work, everyone. We are really civic minded, and it really inspires me how much everyone on this call is doing.